Welcome to a Nanovic lunch lecture. My name is Clemens Sedmak and I serve as director of the Nanovic Institute. I have this written down in case I forgot that. I would like to welcome you to our International Holocaust Remembrance lunch lecture dedicated to the work of Dr. Janusz Korczak. The United Nations General Assembly designated January 27, the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau, as International Holocaust Remembrance Day, a time to remember the 6 million Jewish victims of the Holocaust and the millions of other victims of Nazi persecution. Since January 27 is a Saturday this week, we have, in conversation with the Jewish Federation of St. Joseph Valley and our distinguished speaker, chosen to honor Holocaust Remembrance Day with a lecture today on January 22nd. There are at least 5 reasons why this is a special day for me. I could mention 16, but I decided to mention 5. Firstly, I'm an Austrian, and growing up close to the little-known concentration camp Ebensee brought a sense of the unimaginable atrocities of the Holocaust and the role of both Germany and Austria early into my education. Secondly, one of my first connections with the Nanovic Institute for European Studies was a grant to take 8 graduate students to visit Holocaust memorial sites in southern Germany and Austria. It is so important to remember, and the trip and course that went with it focused on remembering and the common good. In collaboration with the Center for Social Concerns, we visited Dachau, Berchtesgaden, Mauthausen, Schloss Hartheim, Ebensee. One of the highlights of the immersion was an encounter with the oldest Austrian Holocaust survivor, Marco Feingold, who was 104 years old at the time. He died 2 years after that. One student wrote about this encounter with Marco Feingold. This culmination of personal remembering illustrates for us the ethics of memory in action. The ethics of memory in action. Ethics of memory in action, this is what we want to do today. Thirdly, for today's event, we have collaborated with the Jewish Federation of St. Joseph Valley. We are grateful that our friends at the Jewish Federation, notably Aviva Wolfenson, Bob Pfefferman, and Moshe Kruger, have hosted our distinguished speaker for a wonderful event yesterday afternoon. And I'm grateful to my wonderful colleague Mel Webb to have built this bridge. Fourthly, talking about our distinguished speaker, we are so honored to have Professor Michael Dobkowski with us. He's Professor of Religious Studies and Chair of Holocaust Studies at Hobart and William Smith Colleges, and he also holds the John Milton Potter Chair in the Humanities. He's the author or editor of over 10 books, including The Politics of Indifference, Documentary History of Holocaust Victims in America, Jewish American Voluntary Organizations, The Coming Age of Scarcity, and Genocide in the Modern Age. He has led numerous study trips to Germany and Poland. He is, I can testify to that, an impressive person and speaker. Michael, we are so grateful that you are here. The final reason why this is a special day for me is the fact that the lecture will be dedicated to Dr. Janusz Korczak. He's one of my heroes, having a lot to say about dignity and children's rights, the ethics of education, and the ethics of institutions. But also about the hard work of growing up. He has also lived what he taught, as our speaker will remind us. Professor Dobkowski will speak for about 40 minutes, and then I can give him a sign, and then we will have time to engage with him. We will end on time at 1:30 to respect people's busy schedules. Professor Dobkowski, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This has been a wonderful visit so far, a busy visit this morning as well. And in the process of being harried and moving around, I wonder if somebody, Rebecca, I don't want to bother your lunch, but in the office you graciously lent me, there should be my briefcase. And in my briefcase, there's a copy of the Ghetto Diary of Janusz Korczak. Even if I don't actually read from it, I would like to hold it in my hand or have it next to me if you could bring that. It's amazing that there are so many of you are here. I'm really excited, I'm touched by it, and any opportunity that I have to make people aware of Dr. Korczak and his life and the end of his life and his philosophy and how he interacted with people, and as Clemens said, how the structure of the orphanage that he led for 30 years in Warsaw, the Jewish orphanage, I think is, for me, not just gratifying, but incredibly important. So I'm going to try to walk a little bit of a fine line here. So I'm assuming that there are people in the audience who know something about Dr. Korczak, or maybe there's some of you who actually know a great deal about Dr. Korczak. I'm assuming that there are some people in the audience who don't know anything about Dr. Korczak and want to learn more. And maybe the latter is a larger group than the former. Generalizing, I'm even assuming that there are people in the audience today who know a fair amount about the Holocaust, or who believe they know a fair amount about the Holocaust, and are reasonably well informed. I'm also assuming that there are many people in here, and this is not judgmental, this is just all the statistics tell us that. All the studies of what people know and what people don't know in America and in Europe tell us that the majority of people, even in the United States, don't know very much. And if they're asked to name even one concentration camp, but you would assume, or I would assume, that everybody would know Auschwitz, the name of Auschwitz, but there are large percentages. Oh, you're bringing the whole bag. Okay. Nothing private in here. It's just this, actually, and just this, which I might get to. Anyway, that's the fine line. So I better stop procrastinating. But one more moment of procrastination. This is a difficult subject for me. We had a conversation this morning about it. It doesn't get any easier. And I think what you're seeing right now is a little bit of approach avoidance. I know that I need to say some things that are important, and I know I need to say some things that may not be pleasant. It's not fun to say them. It's not fun to think about them and to talk about them. And what's really not fun is sort of my internal battle that I have with myself. Am I representing this correctly? Am I doing it justice? Am I not? Am I exaggerating? Am I underplaying it? Like, the words that may come out of my mouth, I'm not sure what those words will be. I think, I don't think I'm putting too much, I don't think, when I say I mean any of us who deal with this subject, any of us, in whatever capacity, that's a struggle. So enough of approach avoidance, and let's see if I can walk this fine line a little bit. I'm going to start by just giving a little bit of context to Dr. Korczak. What people know about Dr. Korczak, if they do know about him, is they know that he was a famous writer in Poland. He was a famous children's writer in Poland. He was involved in founding the Jewish orphanage in Poland, ran it for 30 years from 1912 until the end of the orphanage in 1942 in the ghetto. Whoops, I am dismantling this podium. Okay, that's weird. I'm not a very handy person, but okay. This has to be repaired at some point. Headline, Jewish scholar from Western New York dismantles private property at Notre Dame, Like, okay. I love Notre Dame, by the way. I've loved Notre Dame since I was a kid. This is approach avoidance again, so I'm sorry. I just do. And there's a deep internal Jewish reason why I do, but I won't get into that. We can talk later. So what people know about him are really those two things. those two aspects of his life. His professional life, maybe we know a little bit about them. I'm going to talk about his professional life. I'm going to talk about his ideas. And the important thing to know about Dr. Korczak is that his ideas were not just theoretical ideas. He believed very strongly, and he wrote very clearly, that theory without practice is actually the reverse of what we should be doing. We should be doing praxis, in his case, living and educating children, and from that you develop theory. You don't develop theory and impose it on whatever your subject matter is. You get your hands dirty, so to speak, in the field, and then you develop your theories. I think that's very inspirational for many of us. I think we need to remind ourselves that even though some of whatever our theories are, I'm sure they're all wonderful, they're relevant. He felt you have to deal with people, you have to deal with children, and you have to create organizations, or you have to create structures within those organizations where those theories can be played out. So I would say what is so remarkable about Dr. Korczak is he was able to do it. For 30 years, he was able to do it. He was able to found 2 orphanages, one for Catholics and one for Jews. He was able, that's amazing in its own right. Poland in the 19-teens, not so simple to think that could be done. That's a pretty, what happened to the baby? She left? Oh, okay.
We'll give it a recording later.
He took an Uber, okay. All right. I mean, I don't have too many babies that attend my talks, so that's really amazing. But Dr. Korczak would be proud that even for 5 minutes. Anyway, okay, what was I saying? Yes, that he founded 2 orphanages. It's been a long 24 hours. He founded 2 orphanages, worked very closely with the Catholic orphanage in Warsaw, and its co-director, but he's most well known for his founding and operation of the Jewish orphanage in Warsaw, again from 1912 to 1942. I think we need a little bit of context here. I'm again walking that line. We need a little bit of context Jewishly. So what's Warsaw? Like, what kind of city is Warsaw in the beginning of the 20th century? From a Jewish point of view, what kind of city is it? It's critically important. It's more important than New York City was in the 19-teens or 1920s, Jewishly speaking. Even though New York City, let's say by the 1930s, had 3 million Jews. But Warsaw was the center of Eastern European Jewish life in the 20th century. It was a city of about 1.3 million people, and it had a Jewish population of about 375,000 people. 30% of the population of Warsaw was made up of Jewish people. 10% of the population of Poland was made up of Jewish people. We need to remind ourselves of that. It's not a small issue. So we have 3.3 million Jews on the eve of World War II in Poland, and by the end of World War II, we have 200,000 Jews. So you just need to understand, it's like ripping from a Polish cultural national point of view, and from a Jewish point of view, it's like a whole culture disappears. The people we know disappeared. They were made to disappear. Okay, we understand that. This is genocide. But we have to understand that this is not just a genocide directed against people. It was a genocide directed against, if we're talking about the Nazi policy vis-a-vis Jews, it was a genocide directed against Jewish culture and Jewish identity and Jewish language, Yiddish. And everything that we think about when we talk about or think about Jewish, Eastern European, we would use the term Ashkenazic Jewish culture. Everything that we think about that is centered really in Poland. The center of Jewish life in Europe is Poland, and the center of that center is Warsaw. So anything you have, any imagination you have about Jewish life in the 1920s and 1930s in Poland, it's in Warsaw. All the good and all the not so good, right? Everything is there. The height of intellectual contribution, writers, playwrights, filmmakers, poets, historians, linguists, Zionists, anti-Zionists, Bundists, socialists, it's all there. Criminals and prostitutes, and it's all there. Very devout Jews and Jews that have nothing to do with organized religion. It's all in Warsaw. That's the Warsaw that nurtured Janusz Korczak. He does not come from a, his birth name is Heinrich Goldschmidt. Henry Goldschmidt in English. That's his birth name. He adopted the name Janusz Korczak once he began to write, and we can talk maybe about why he did that. This is the community that he grew up in. He grew up a very cultured, assimilated Polish Jew. His parents knew that they were Jewish. They had Jewish identity, but they weren't really practicing Jews. They probably didn't go to synagogue. We don't believe that Janusz Korczak had a bar mitzvah or any formal confirmation, so to speak, into Judaism. We know that he was fluent in European languages, obviously in Polish. He wrote in Polish. He wrote a beautiful Polish. I can't read literary Polish. It's a beautiful language and a difficult language. But people who have read Janusz Korczak in the original tell me it's not an easy language. Even for people who are born in Poland, know Polish, it's not an easy language. It's a literary Polish language. He was gifted at that. He was a great writer. He was a great speaker in Polish. He didn't speak Jewish languages. He didn't know Hebrew. He certainly didn't know Yiddish. He was very Polish in many ways. He represented that sort of segment of Polish society, Jewish society, which was very assimilated into Poland and loved Poland. He loved Poland. He was a Polish nationalist. He also gradually, as we go into the 1930s, and I hope in the question and answer, if I'm skipping over large parts of issues, you can get back to me, get back to us, we can discuss them. In the 1930s, and now he's in the orphanage, right? He lives in the orphanage. It's in Warsaw. It's on Krochmalna Street, the famous street in Warsaw, that both had that both went into and out of the ghetto. His original building for the orphanage was outside of the ghetto. So let's go to the ghetto period for a second. What do I mean by ghetto? Here we're talking about the Nazi ghettos. So again, if you know about all this, I apologize. I won't spend a lot of time on it, but I think it's important to know the context. So World War II, as we know it, began with the invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939. And 3 weeks later, Warsaw fell. The capital of the country fell. Warsaw fell under German and then combined German and Soviet occupation. German occupation from the west, Soviet occupation on the east. That's a very important subject. We need to think about it. We need to know about Soviet occupation. We need to know about Soviet oppression. It's a subject on its own. And sometimes when I give this talk or versions of this talk, people get very angry, I guess, at me and write me emails. How come you didn't talk more about the Soviet occupation? I didn't because it's not really Janusz Korczak's story, really. So I'm focusing on the part of Poland that was occupied by Nazi Germany. Very quickly, the Nazis began to implement their policies. Ghettoization was one of the first steps. Identification of Jews, collection of Jews, and ghettoization of Jews. And this is not a metaphor. Here I don't mean ghetto as a metaphor. It's not a symbolic ghetto. It's a physical ghetto. I mean, you understand? It's a physical, bounded, walled-in ghetto in Warsaw. And Warsaw was the largest ghetto established by the Nazis and Jews. The second largest was in the city of Łódź, or Lodz, as it's L-O-D-Z in English. Ultimately, by the time the ghetto was closed in, literally walled in, about 11 miles of walls, and if some of you have been to Warsaw or will visit Warsaw, you'll see remnants of the wall. There's not too many remnants of the wall left, but it's worth seeing. The ghetto was walled in, So we're talking about approximately 422 acres. We're talking about, like, any of you been to Central Park in New York? I'm showing my New York parochialism. It's about the size of New York's Central Park. But you have 30% of the population crammed into about 2.3% of the landmass of the city. So when we're talking about ghetto, we're talking about unbelievable overcrowding. And we're talking about people being moved in and out. We're talking about Polish non-Jews who lived in the confines of what was to be the ghetto being moved out of the ghetto, about 120,000, and Jews who lived on the other side being moved in. Tremendous confusion, overcrowding, suffering. I think you have to use your imaginations. I don't have a lot of time to go into it, but just think about what that might mean. You lived in one place for a long time. This is Europe. People were not particularly mobile, right? They're not like Americans that we move 10, 12 times in our lifetimes. It's not a big deal, maybe. People are accustomed to their homes, and now they're uprooted from their homes. And we have not only the native Jews of Warsaw, the Varshavian Jews, but we have about 150, 175,000 refugees, as they were called, from the towns and villages outside of Warsaw being crammed in. So by the time we're all done, by the time the ghetto is sealed, let's say November 15th, 1940, we have about 450,000, give or take, Jews crammed into the Warsaw Ghetto. From November 40 to the beginning of the Jewish rebellion against, in the Warsaw Ghetto, which began on April 19th, 1943, that's going to give you essentially the chronology of the Warsaw Ghetto from early 1940 to May 10th, May 11th, 1943, the end of the Warsaw Ghetto Rebellion, which is punctuated by the Nazi leadership by the destruction of the great synagogue of Warsaw, one of the great architectural sacred places of Eastern European Judaism, which is on the other side of the ghetto, which was blown up to sort of say, this is the end. Done. No more Jewish history in Warsaw. No more Jewish history in Poland. That's the period. But that's the period when Dr. Korczak, where his, let's put it this way. That's the period when he's really tested. That's the period when he's really tested. His theories, like I said, that come from practical experience, that's where I think we find out who the real Dr. Korczak was. Maybe that's an exaggeration. I think he was always real, but our eyes, our minds are focused on that period. His orphanage, as I said, was on the other side of the ghetto, on the so-called Aryan side of the ghetto. He was forced to move with the children into the ghetto on a street called Dzielna Street, 5 Dzielna Street. He moved about 200 children. That's about the number of children that the ghetto, that the orphanage could carry by capacity, about 200 children at a time. The age range of the children in the ghetto were approximately, in the orphanage, were approximately 7 or 8 to 12. They stayed in the orphanage for 6, 7 years. Prior to the establishment of the ghetto, they would wake up in the morning, they would have breakfast, they would do their chores. Stefania Wilżenska, who was his like right-hand person, that we have to remember her. You know, the Korczak name is known, but her name is not really known. Stefania Wilżenska. There is no Korczak orphanage without Stefania Wilżenska. There is no Janusz Korczak, frankly, without Stefania Wilżenska. But because of gender roles and gender bias and all kinds of things we can talk about, people don't know about her. But she was critical. They eat breakfast, they're dressed, they're washed, they do their chores, they clean up, they do whatever they're supposed to do. And then, like all Polish children, they walk to school. Like all many European children, They walk to school, and they go to school for, this is before the ghetto. Whatever it is, 3, 4 hours, 5 hours, they come back, they have lunch, and then the rest of the day they're in the ghetto and in the orphanage, and they have their responsibilities. So test number 1, he wanted to, but needed to transmit his approach, which worked very well for a couple of decades outside the ghetto, into the ghetto context. Now again, overcrowding, ultimately starvation, 600, 700, 800 calories by official rations. The only way the ghetto survived was by smuggling. People are beginning to get sick. They're beginning to starve. They're literally beginning to starve to death. I'm not exaggerating. I'm not exaggerating anything here. For anything, I'm understating it. Eventually, deaths. I don't know what you know about Jewish death rituals and Jewish funeral rituals. I don't know if you know much about it. But like many religions, like Christianity as well, the body is sacred. The body has to be treated. The body has to be buried properly. There's a ritual about this. Jews care a lot about it. Eventually, death so exceeded life in the ghetto that it was impossible. So we have, maybe some of you have seen these photographs of mass graves. People were just literally dying. They were dying on the street, many of them children. Many of them children. The most vulnerable would be the children and the aged. But one thing we can say about a couple of things we can say about Korczak's orphanage. His children didn't starve. They didn't starve. That he was able, some might say magically, figure out ways to bring food into the orphanage that maybe other people couldn't even know how he did it. And that's partly because of his reputation, partly because he had many, many contacts. So what I'm I don't know what number I'm up to. The second thing, or the fifth thing that I'm most, what did you have, 5 points? The fifth point that I'm most impressed about is not only his effort to maintain his system, and I haven't really talked about his system, but I will in a second, because we're running, okay. But he was able to maintain his system in the most difficult circumstances. In the most difficult circumstances. An underlying principle of Dr. Korczak, which I haven't said yet, is that not only are all human beings important and have dignity, or have the right to dignity, and should have the right to love, and should have the right to caring, and should be taken care of, but particularly children. Children. Then and now, as I think some people said in yesterday's talk, then and now, I'm sure with some exceptions, maybe all of you are exceptions, we don't really care that much about children. If you really think about it, children are not recognized as important, and in his view, as important as adults, or maybe even more important than adults. Children are just small adults in his mind. They have the same rights that everybody else has. Rights of dignity, the rights to love, the rights to care, the rights to responsibility. I don't know if I talked enough about this yesterday. Korczak did not believe in, that everything should be given to people without responsibility. Everybody is responsible. Everybody has responsibility. In his orphanage, there is no hierarchy. Dr. Korczak and his small staff of 4 or 5 people, and then his staff of interns, what we might call interns. These were people who were studying to be educators, who would help out. Everybody was equal in this context. Nobody had more power. Nobody had less power. Nobody had more responsibility. Nobody had less responsibility. We talk about education. Many of us, all of us, hopefully talk about education as a reciprocal process. There's teacher and student. There's student and teacher. He really believed that. Education is a two-way process. The so-called educators have to be educated by their pupils, and the pupils have to be educated by their educators. Everybody's an educator. That's why he was such a famous writer. He wrote books about how to love a child, which was a bestseller in Poland. How to Love a Child in English. Go read it. Go find it. Hopefully your library has it. I haven't checked. How to Love a Child. He wrote it when he was on the front during World War I. You know, not systematic theory, not like, you know, like chapter 1 deals with this stage of life, that stage of life. You know, I'm not criticizing particular theorists here. Just like life experiences, everybody has responsibility. Everybody is an educator. He believed, and I think as maybe has been mentioned, he didn't just talk about the responsibility to children. He believed children have rights. And just like every other group, every other constituent group in society, children have rights. They need to be, those rights need to be articulated. Those rights need to be sanctioned or supported by international governing bodies. And he talked about the rights of children. And he never actually finished his list of the rights of children. Maybe if I have a moment at the end, I'll read some of those rights. But it's very interesting. In his book, How to Love a Child, which he wrote on the front in World War I, he listed 3 rights, if I remember them correctly. Children, he said, they have at least these 3 rights. Like, what do you think about this? Children have the right to their suffering. Children have the right to their possessions. Children have the right for the moment of the day, for the situation that they're in the day. I don't know exactly what he meant by these, you know, because he's often, at least for me, sometimes, I mean, it's sometimes not so clear exactly what he meant, but eventually, I think we can parse out a list of about 20 rights that eventually the League of Nations in 1924 and the United Nations in 1959 and the United Nations in 1989 adopted most of his ideas about the rights, the Convention on the Rights of Children. This is Janusz. Many people don't know that, but this is coming from him. This is coming from his work. Children, I love this. Children have the right to religion, and he's not a religious person. Children have the right to die. Some people don't like that statement and maybe find it a little bit unnerving. But he was living in a world where death was ubiquitous, where every place you stepped, everything you saw in the last years was there. And he didn't believe, as I said, in sheltering children from the realities of life, of poverty, of oppression by adults, of domination by adults, ultimately of cruelty. Children should know about this. That's his philosophy. We may or may not agree, but he believed in that, and he believed that if you deprive children, I think what he meant in a way, if you deprive children of the right to die, I think what he meant was you're actually not treating children like adults. Because ultimately we all, at some point in life, will think about death, and it is a reality, and we have the right to think about that. We have the right, we need to. And you can't say that some adults, some people over the age of X, and you put in the X, they have the right, and people under the age of X don't have the right. That doesn't make sense to him. That's not, he didn't believe in these kinds of what he would call false distinctions, false dichotomies. And this was practiced in his orphanage in the most extreme circumstances. A governing structure. He created the concept of citizenship in the orphanage. When new children came in, they had to be voted in in various grades of citizenship, and there was a process where they could ultimately become full citizens of the orphanage. He created a parliament. He created a newspaper in the orphanage, but not only that, he created a national newspaper. This is before the Nazis invaded, a national newspaper where he had editors who were 8 years old, 10 years old, 12 years old, had an office in Warsaw, and they would bring in, they would read hundreds of articles and selections and poems written by Polish children, and he published a national Polish youth newspaper in Poland. He had the most popular radio program in Poland, Polish national radio. The program was called The Old Doctor. People knew about him. I'm trying to convey that. And all of this is, he's still functioning in the ghetto. This is making, like when I think about it, it's like crazy. In this environment, now some people would say, the name Hannah Arendt? So some people would say, Hannah Arendt, this is lunacy. What were these people doing? They were about to be killed. Didn't they know what was happening? And they're having discussions about philosophy, and Janusz Korczak is preparing his children to perform a play? Like, this is lunacy. Prepare them for the reality, that what's about to happen. Or, this is a kind of complicity. This is where the victim kind of makes it easier for the victimizer to do what the victimizers do. So there's some controversies here, but I don't actually see it that way. Just obviously, my opinion is just my opinion. You can take it or leave it. I think there was an overriding issue here for him, which is dignity, and which is what he called ameliorative, what we would call in English, ameliorative compassion. It's not just compassion, like words, empathy, like I'll take care, I care about you, sorry you're not feeling well. It's, you're in my school, and you have some issues, and I'm going to try to understand what your issues are. I'm going to find a way to be compassionate to your issues, but to help you cope with your issues in a responsible, honest way, whatever those issues are. We know about Janusz Korczak because of the end of Janusz Korczak. I hope everybody here will know about Janusz Korczak a little bit now, and I hope in a very, very small way I've piqued your interest a little bit in Janusz Korczak. What was the end, in case you don't know? So on July 22nd, 1942, the so-called Great Deportation, it's not great because it's great, the large deportation, the Große Aktion, the big action began in Warsaw. This was the deportation of 5,000 to 10,000 Jews every single day from July 22nd, 1942 till the middle of September 1942 to the killing camp Treblinka about 60 miles away that ultimately killed 350,000, give or take, Varshavian Jews, not just Varshavian Jews. Ultimately, 800,000 people were killed, gassed in Treblinka. Treblinka is a total killing camp. It's, I sometimes say this and people say, what do you mean? How could it be worse than Auschwitz? There were more victims in Auschwitz. I think there are gradations of torture. Treblinka was unbelievable. Nothing was going on except the killing, the gassing and cremation of human beings. There's almost no time from the time that the trains arrived. The only thing that delayed death in Treblinka was a backup of the trains as they were coming every single day, hours every day. trains would be unloaded. There's a whole process. You have lunch in front of you, or you just finished lunch. You can imagine. This is the deportation that emptied 350,000 of the 450,000, probably less already, because about 80,000 Jews had already died of starvation in Warsaw. And the day that the deportations began, the head of the Jewish community in Warsaw, the head of the Jewish council in Warsaw, I think we should know his name. His name is Adam Cherniakov, committed suicide. I hate talking about suicide. I'm not talking about it. I hate talking about suicide in any context. It's against the Jewish religion. It's against the Catholic religion. But I think Adam Cherniakov would not sign that order to deport 5,000 people on July 22nd. He just wouldn't. And he took his life. I'm not making a judgment. I'm just stating a fact. You can judge him however you want. And Korczak knew that in a week or two it would be the orphanages in Warsaw. And it was. On August 5th, some people say August 6th, the order came down to begin to empty the orphanages of Warsaw. And Korczak had prepared his children, the children in the orphanage, 3 or 4 days before. He actually rehearsed. And this might be a controversial point on how they should behave. He wanted them to behave in an orderly fashion. Not that they had great clothes, but he dressed them in the best clothes that they had. And he tried to make that march from the orphanage to the northernmost part of the Warsaw Ghetto, through a gate to the Aryan side, through another gate to an open field, which is referred to as the Umschlagplatz, the gathering place where they were waiting for the trains. And all the first-hand accounts that we have of that march, with no exception, all talk about the remarkable nature of what they were witnessing. Here you have Dr. Korczak walking with the youngest children, followed by Stefania Wilżenska with the 9 to the 12-year-olds, walking in an orderly fashion. I'm not saying nobody was crying, I don't know. I'm not saying nobody was screaming, I don't know. But in the relation to how other people were responding to the Umschlagplatz experience, which, by the way, itself is horrific. There were thousands of people collected on the Umschlagplatz, thousands, no water, no food. This is August, right? The hot Polish sun, no place to relieve yourself, waiting for the trains. I apologize, I always feel badly when I start getting so specific, but that was the reality. And when people describe the Korczak group of 192 or 193 children, we don't know exactly, it's one of those two numbers, and 5 or 6 staff members, they don't describe that. They don't describe them crying, they don't describe them screaming. So I'm just taking the personal accounts of witnesses who witnessed it. And they went into the trains, and then we know what their ultimate destiny was. But interestingly, or not, we don't know exactly when they died. There's actually a dispute. With academics, there's always a dispute. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. says that they died on August 6th, 1942. And Yad Vashem in Jerusalem said that they died on August 7th, 1962. And the only difference is, and Yad Vashem has a major project going on to try to document every single transport that they could, and every single person, if they could identify. So for example, we know exactly when Anna Freud was deported to Treblinka and when she died, the daughter of Sigmund Freud, because we have her name in the transport. So there is a dispute. So why does it matter if he died on August 6th or August 7th? So for observant Jews, or Jews who even observe, again, mourning rituals, it's very important to know, in Yiddish or Hebrew, this would be called the Yortzeit, the anniversary of the death of. So there are people who mark the anniversary of the death of Janusz Korczak. I'm going to end. And they need to know if it's August 6th or August 7th. So I think, and the last thing I'll say is, again, we can discuss this, I think the end of, just like Janusz Korczak said himself about life and death itself, they are part of a continuum. Death is not fundamentally separated from life. Life is not fundamentally separated from death. They're part of a continuum. So I believe how Janusz Korczak behaved at the end of his life, the compassion he demonstrated to the children. He had opportunities to be saved. People could have taken him out of the ghetto because he was a very, very, very well-known person in Europe, and the Nazis knew about him. The Nazis knew about him, and there were German guards, this is what witnesses say, German officers at the Umschlagplatz who kind of said, wink, 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 we're not looking now. Take him out, take him out. He's Janusz Korczak. And he said, no, I'm not going. If the children are going, I'm going. And I see that in many ways as the ultimate act of compassion. Thank you very much. Read, buy, read, rent, whatever, the Ghetto Diary of Janusz Korczak. You'll get a sense of the man.
Thank you so much, Professor Dobkowski. Michael, we have 13 minutes for any questions or comments you want to make. The floor is open. We have Becca with a mic, and somebody would like to ask the first question. Morgan is happy to ask the first question. I give it to Morgan. Is it okay?
Yes, thank you very much for your talk. I was one of the people who didn't know very much, so I learned a lot. You talked about how he was able to maintain conditions even moving into the ghetto. When I think about resilience, you can maintain, but you can also maybe adapt or change. Were there ways in which he had to change or adapt his approach specifically in the ghetto, or was it really trying to, find ways to just continue on as usual? And was there like a philosophy behind that?
It's a very good question. So I would refer you to the Ghetto Diary. In the Ghetto Diary, he started to write or at least we have the manuscript portions that remained. Maybe he began to write it earlier, but what we have begins in May and ends on August 4th. So it's the most intense period, the last period of his life. And you'll read some things in the diary that might disturb you. Meaning he talks about alcohol, and he probably talks about drugs, and he thinks about suicide, and of course says, no, I'm not doing that. That would be the most irresponsible thing. And he talks about his deterioration of his body and the deterioration of his mind, and how he can't walk up the steps to his attic bedroom so easily anymore, and how he doesn't really want the residents to see him this way, so he tries not to have them not see him this way. So I'm not answering your question because I don't really know the answer. I am sure he adapted to the circumstances he was in. He didn't live in a kind of world where it was rigid and where what's happening outside doesn't matter and what's happening inside doesn't matter. I think he was the kind of person and educator that just didn't feel comfortable doing that. So my guess is that he adapted where he could, but he kept the main structures, because the main structures, and I think you would agree that structure can be helpful to how we live. What we actually, how we build our institutions. So if we're interested in compassionate institutions, we have to build into them a structure which generates compassion. It just doesn't happen. And if we're interested in compassionate families, we have to do that. So I'm sure he adapted, but I can't, I don't have more specific information. His main writings, and he was a prolific writer. I mean, I mentioned just a few very famous children's books, King Mat I, Kaitik the Wizard. I recommend them to you, or I recommend them to your children. Read them to your children, read them for yourselves. I was remiss yesterday and didn't give my granddaughter Seema. So my granddaughter Seema is 10 years old, and I brought her a copy of King Mat I, his most famous children's book, 2.5, 3 weeks ago when I visited them in Florida. And I kind of said, Seema, what do you think? She's a voracious reader. How about reading this? Would you read it? Would you be honest with me? Would you tell me what you think? And she said, sure. She calls me Zadie. Sure, Zadie, I'll read it. Grandfather, sure, Zadie, pleasure. And she read it, and she, when she finished over the weekend, she said, I loved it. I loved it. And so I had a conversation with her. What did you love? What did you love? And when she said, what I loved is that King Mat kind of was trying to reverse the world, where children rule the world. It's a fantasy, we know it in other contexts. And the adults would have to go back to school. But ultimately, the adults win, because they're not so kind. So there's an ending, he ends in exile. So it's anyway, it's a fantasy, it's a realistic fantasy. So what I'm saying is I wish that we had his real reflections of those last months, but he was probably so busy keeping people alive that.
Thank you. Over here, yes, please.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us. I was just wondering, I know that you said that the orphanage ranged in ages 7 to 12, but I also know that you talked about how one of his main beliefs was that every kid had equal value and worth regardless of their age. So I was just wondering, was that the age range with the greatest need, or why did he not take in any really young or really old kids?
There were children younger than, that's a good question. There were children younger than 7 or 8 for sure. The orphanage, I think it was a practical decision, and maybe it was, again, a socially conditioned or culturally conditioned tradition where I don't think he felt the orphanage could maximize its benefit if he was dealing with 1 or 2 or 3 years old children. Not that they didn't have need and not that they didn't have dignity, they did, but again, he had a very small staff, and even in the best of times, he was always scrounging around for financial support, let's say before the war, and it was basically supported by the community. I don't think there was like a philosophical reason for it. I think it was a practical reason, but there were some children younger. And by the way, he took quite a few children that I guess we would say would be very challenging. He talks about some of them in the ghetto diary, and he still took them. And he even kept them in the orphanage, even if they, what he considered, threatened the safety of other children in the orphanage. He didn't give up on people. So, and again, it's people, even though they're just shorter people, that's all they are. Shorter people.
Thank you. Tom.
Thanks very much. How is he regarded in Poland today? Because you mentioned last night that he had a powerful Polish and Jewish identity. And I'm wondering, is he remembered in Poland as a Polish intellectual who was Jewish and saved children? Is he primarily remembered as a Jewish savior? How is his reputation in Poland, and how important is it?
No, I think it's again a very good question. We had breakfast with Amelia, what's her last name?
Justin Powell.
Powell, in international relations law. She's from Poland, and I asked her that question. She grew up with Janusz Korczak, so didn't ask Amelia how old she is, but I'm going to say Amelia would be somewhere, big range, somewhere between 35 and 45. Fair or not fair? Forget it. I'm getting myself into trouble. So she said she grew up with Janusz Korczak. So her generation definitely grew up. And I asked her your question. What about contemporary kids? Are they reading or do they know? And her answer was, yes, I'm pretty sure that they are. He's a national hero in Poland. There's no question about it. He's a Polish, I think the way you put it, you said Polish intellectual of Jewish background. I think that's the way he's portrayed. And Korczak, if I could imagine the way Korczak would portray himself, he would emphasize both his Polishness and his Jewishness. And he would find it very strange that people in some groups would want to own the legacy of Janusz Korczak, whether it's Polish, whether it's Jewish. That's not the way he was a kind of a trans-ethnic or trans-national person. I could be Polish, I can be Jewish. I love Poland. I mean, in his voice, I love aspects about Jewish culture. There are things about Polish culture I don't like. There are things about Jewish culture I don't like. I'm a resident of Poland who happens to be Jewish, who would prefer that the Polish Republic not have experienced these horrific, conditions under Nazi Germany. I mean, the Polish people suffered tremendously. It's a complicated country, Poland. It has a lot of ethnic, there are ethnic issues there between the various ethnic groups. He would, I think, stand up proudly as a citizen of both.
Thank you. Brief question. Yeah.
Is there a sense of his legacy as far as pedagogy goes? And I'm thinking of, it reminds me a lot of like Reggio Emilia method, right? Which that was post World War II. And then I'm thinking too, like in America, like a Robert Coles sort of figure who talks about children of poverty, children of versus children of privilege. And so is there something about his pedagogy that emerged out of struggle, out of trauma, or is it something that was established quite before that?
So there are levels of trauma. So I would say, first of all, if you're dealing with an orphanage, this is a pediatrician who chooses to change his career path and be a director of an orphanage. So we just need to think about that for a minute, right? And he's a pediatrician who's a very popular writer and kind of public intellectual, but who chooses to live and work in an orphanage. So by definition, everybody in the orphanage has suffered trauma. So his pedagogy definitely comes out of trauma. Now there's trauma and there's trauma. So it comes out of trauma. It's maybe transformed in trauma, maybe. And I'm not an expert in this field, but my understanding is that he's not alone, even in Poland or in Europe. There are other pedagogical thinkers and practitioners who are working on the same kinds of issues. So he's part of that, if you want to call it a movement. And he probably would be proud to be connected with someone like Coles. I think he would say he's taking my legacy or my ideas another step. So yes, I mean, I think so, yes.
Actually, we are at time. Do you want to have 30 seconds to close us off, maybe with this?
Oh, yes. So I have a little gift, if you like. So there is there are international Janusz Korczak societies, and there's an American Janusz Korczak society. And this is just a little identification card. It has a quote from Janusz Korczak. It has a website that you can check out on Janusz Korczak. And if you have any interest at all in exploring more of Janusz Korczak, this would just be a reminder. So please take one. And it's a gift. And make good use of it. And by the way, I thank you so much for coming here and for an interesting conversation. I apologize that we don't have more time, but we have to be mindful of everyone's schedule.
So let's thank Professor Dobkowski. Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I also want to thank Becca and Mel and Keith and Morgan and Abby and everybody else who has worked hard to make this happen. Enjoy the rest of the day, and don't forget that Janusz Korczak in his diary mentions a prayer he said as a young man: God, I'm not asking you for an easy life. I ask you for a difficult life, but beautiful and dignified. Enjoy your difficult lives. Thank you.